I know you've already had a mini sermon. This will be a bit longer, but not too much longer. There is really no better story than the exodus of the Jewish people from 400 years of slavery in Egypt to relate to the political highlights, lowlights, social, economic dynamics that were already mentioned this morning by Annie. In the story, God is faithful to God's people, including those who are aliens, those who are undocumented, those who are immigrants, refugees, and to those that are oppressed. God's justice will not be denied. In the story, God is faithful to God's people. But it's also a great story about what it means to give up oneself for the cause of justice and equity. Moses takes on God's call, gives up personal comfort and security in the houses of the kings and princes and princesses of Egypt for the sake of serving one particular group of people. He is, of course, a reluctant prophet, but he has an incredibly unusual physical encounter with God on Mount Horeb. Thank you, Annie, for your unusual encounter. As an instrument of divine justice and freedom, Moses receives that dramatic call from God, and he reflects what most of us experience, if indeed we've had a bizarre, unusual experience, or we're being called to be an instrument of social change. And of course, Moses says, I'm not worthy. I am not worthy. And I really don't necessarily want to go to that place of refugees and immigrants today, with the story of the closing potentially of our border closed, no refugees, a threat to potential funding for a proposed border wall or a fence, the stories of sick and dying refugee children in the holding cells and detention centers under the eye of our government agencies. Annie, I agree. They need to be protected from us Americans. Today, you know the stories. I don't have to repeat those stories. You know the injustice. But my question, as I've heard the round of news media this week again, has been, where is God in all of this? And I do believe that we as a people, as a culture, as a nation, are in thin places right now. Our society, our culture, we're in that between space, between justice and between injustice. This time in our country, in our world, in our individual lives, we are between the divine and the human. And who is going to win ultimately, if there is indeed a win? I think God is speaking to us and calling us to a greater, deeper awareness. This, my friends, is what we call a liminal space. A liminal space. But if you go back to about 1200 BC, as I was explaining to the young people this morning, the Celtic people began to emerge throughout Europe. And they had what they called a thin space, or a liminal space in our contemporary culture today. In Celtic tradition, a thin place is where the veil that separates heaven and earth is nearly transparent. A place where we experience a deep sense of God's presence in our everyday world, which is what Annie illustrated for us today. A thin place is where, for a moment, the spiritual and the natural worlds intersect. We feel unified and we feel connected to the divine, to God, or whatever name you give that entity. It is not an intellectual knowing, it's felt in the Spirit. There are holy places, there are liminal places, there are thin moments, if we just pay attention and let our spirits see those. I believe, given the refugee and the fear of the alien, not only in the United States but across the globe, as we seem to be losing our humanity and even creation is in upheaval with an increase in effects from global warming, I think God is closer now than ever. Earth and heaven are touching. The veil between heaven and between the divine is incredibly thin. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning says this: Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God, but only he or she who sees takes off his or her shoes. The rest, they sit around it and they pluck blackberries. So when Moses encounters the burning bush that we heard read for us, that veil between heaven and earth seems to disappear, between God and human. It's a thin and a liminal space. Moses was just kind of minding his own business. He was taking care of the sheep. He had a relatively good job. Maybe it's not necessarily the kind of futures we hope for. And occasionally in his mind, I'm assuming he wandered back to Egypt, back to family and friends. And he'd been banished because he murdered one of the overseers. So you have the bush, you have the voice, you have the holy, the sacred, the thin, the liminal, on this just plain old dusty mountain in the desert, dotted with a few scruffy bushes and sheep droppings, just like our desert here that surrounds Phoenix. And in that holy, thin, liminal, thin space, Moses hides his face. And he turns away. Is it fear? Is it respect? Is it shame? God can and God does designate any place as holy ground. The places where we have sacred encounters can be anywhere God is, and God is everywhere. Deepak Chopra said this: the presence of God is everywhere. You have only to embrace it with your attention. Are we aware? Are you aware of the liminal, thin places where human and divine touch? Can you embrace God's presence with your attention, with your intuitions? Can you feel the presence of some divine energy? The question is, can you really feel God? We don't talk about that a lot, especially as good progressive Protestants. Can you really feel God? A close friend of mine who claims to be an atheist can quote Scripture much better than I can. He knows church history much better than I do. He knows all of the creeds and all of the councils and all of that history. And he can speak at length about Christians in the media, whether it's the latest prediction about the end of the world or significant comment from a credible source or incredible source. When we have coffee together, we talk politics, we talk music, we talk literature, we talk the current state of affairs of our universe. But I've never actually directly talked to him about what he believes or doesn't believe. See, I'm not always such a great pastor. But he sent me this message the other day, and this is what it said. James, I don't believe in God. I never asked him, by the way. I don't believe in God because I've never felt God. I don't believe in God because I've never felt God. I vividly remember the very most, what I would call the most spiritual moment I ever had in my life. It had everything that those spiritual moments should have. I was out in the wilderness. There was a profound sense of being lost and confused because I seem to always get lost, even in my car or in the wilderness or sometimes walking around. I was confused, and suddenly there's a stranger, there's a conversation, and between it all, something crystallizes in my memory that I was not alone. Yet if I were told the story here and I would recount the story, it wouldn't have the same effect on you, and you also might say along with, you might need to have some sort of, therapy. It would be just maybe a nice story. But for me at the time, it gave me the strength and it gave me the courage that I needed to be who I was and who I needed to be on my continuing journey of life. That being said, I was still compelled to respond to my atheist friend by saying, I think a lot of people don't feel much of anything, which is why we oftentimes do so much, because we're trying to feel something. We want to feel God. But maybe a better question for some of us is this. Do you ever feel like God doesn't really get how you feel? Have you ever felt that way? Or do you feel that way right now? You know, in the lives of saints and those that were mystics, spiritual experiences didn't necessarily happen very often. In fact, quite the opposite was true. There were gaps of years between those mystical moments and experiences with the divine. But when they had those experiences, there were consuming experiences. You know, we get really consumed with work. I do. We're consumed with relationships. We're consumed with addictions. And there's a difference, though, between being consumed with something and being consumed by something. In Exodus 3, Moses, again, is simply taking care of the sheep, his father-in-law's flock. There was no shame in that. And honestly, it would sound really satisfying after being in social work and being a pastor these many years, because sheep can't really talk back. They don't complain. A herd of sheep, it really sounds quite glorious right now. But something within Moses calls him forward, and he finds himself at the base of a mountain, Mount Horeb. And one can only imagine what drew him there. I think he had a lot of questions about this supposed God. He had just left Egypt, and supposedly God had been in the thin places in Egypt, and they escaped. What was God's plan for him? Would God be consumed with Moses, or would Moses be consumed by God? And you have a burning bush, which potentially could consume Moses in the middle of the desert. Moses was seeking a holy conversation with God, a conversation that was marked by holy ground, keeping distance, taking off shoes, and a feeling of intimacy with the divine that marked Moses for the rest of his adult life. And he died at about 500 years old. This was a thin, liminal space. I've struggled, really, throughout my ministry and throughout the time that I first heard this story about why shoes off? Why the shoes off? You know, it's really nice symbolism, but what does it mean? Well, as I was sitting with a cup of coffee Friday, Saturday, I finally had the aha moments that I was looking for. Don't come any closer until you take off your shoes. I think it's symbolic of the barriers that we all have. You know, our shoes are barriers to feeling the soil and the earth. I have a lot of barriers between myself and God, and sometimes between other people. It's our soul, the sole of our shoes. Sometimes our soul creates barriers between God and others and self. So for me, removing those barriers, removing those shoes, and feeling the earth, the experience of the thin, liminal places of life. I don't know how many of you go barefoot, but I'm from Mississippi originally. I can't wait till I get my shoes off. The more I can feel the ground and the soil beneath me, the better it is. Removing our ego. Removing our self-centeredness, removing our excuses and our fears, our souls, so that we can be more attached to what we can't see rather than what we see around us. Feet are really homely. You can notice this person obviously had a fresh pedicure. We have such a hate-love relationship with our feet. At least I do. Maybe our feet are symbolic. Maybe they're symbolic of our true hidden selves, that we like to dress up with pedicures, with nice shoes and stilettos. Maybe it's a sign of admitting that true self that Moses takes off his shoes, because As my aunt says, life is messy. Our relationship with God is messy. Our relationship with our partners and with our friends and our family, it's messy. I often have what I call hard conversations that I entitle shoe-off talks, especially with those that I supervise, like Pastor Susan or Ellie or Joshua. Oh, he's gone. It's those shoe-off talks when it seems important to clear the air, to set some boundaries, to clear up misconceptions, to set things straight, to apologize for my part and seek forgiveness. So I ask you, when is the last time you had a shoe-off talk with God? When did you have a heart-to-heart with God? Clear up some of your misconceptions. Settle up. Set your ego aside and, let God be God. When is the last time your barriers came down, you took your shoes off, and you had a good laugh, or maybe a good cry, or a good moment of silent reflection? Thin places, liminal places, sacred moments, holy ground is all around us. It's really about simply being open and taking off your shoes and getting real, and sometimes getting down and getting dirty with God. I do that pretty much on a daily, sometimes hourly basis. So holy ground, it really is around us everywhere and engulfs us. It's in the hospital room when that person you know is becoming translucent as they're beginning their last phase of life. Holy ground is in the room in which you've been invited to hear somebody else's aching heart. There was some holy ground actually when after service, Annie and I sat down over here in the pews and had a conversation about the individual she calls Lars. Profound experiences often come in the form of ordinary situations. I'm reminded of one of my favorite quotes in a book I'm also currently journaling, and I've been journaling about this quote a number of times. It says, feeling unsure and lost is a part of your path. Don't avoid it. See what those feelings are showing you and use it, and take a breath. You'll be okay, even if you don't feel okay all the time. Well, I think that's what was happening in Moses' life. 40 years of wandering, thin, liminal spaces for 40 years, which they could have missed, and they could have written off, and they could have went in all the wrong directions. And when Moses wonders, who the heck is this God that has led these people out of Egypt into Israel, that we are wandering with for 40 years? Why has this God chosen us? God simply says, I am who I am. Tell the people, I am. Now, honestly, as a human, that would not be enough for me. I doubt that it'd be enough for you. I am who I am. Take off your shoes and follow, and be vulnerable, and be bare, and be raw. As living beings, we all have the same destination, don't we? We're all eventually going to go to the same place. So that's really unlikely to motivate any of us. What drives us? What engages us? What makes life worth living? What makes each one of us unique? What brings joy and what brings suffering that allows us to learn something on the journey? For me, and I hope for you, this journey means being open and searching for the sacred, thin, liminal moments in life, moments when the human and the divine touch. And oh, by the way, the human and the divine have already touched in you, because you are both human and divine. My prayer is that as a faith community, and this includes the guests and visitors who are here for even the first time, is that we will have an opening in this new year, because I think, as Annie said, this has been a tough year for those of us who are justice-seeking people. It's been a tough year on our emotions. It's been a tough year on our movement forward when we thought we were gaining so much ground and we began to lose ground. But here we are in our own fiery, dusty, dirty desert, just like Moses, just like the children of Israel. May we hear, may we experience, and yes, may we feel God. That's what I hope for all of us. May we feel the God within, the divine spark. May we hear clear callings, and may we step out, take off our shoes, and be full of divine love and divine mercy and all the good gifts that Spirit desires to bestow on us. May it be so.